You are standing at the edge of camp. It is roughly 40,000 years ago. The fire burned low overnight, and no one stoked it. That is the first sign something is wrong. The second sign is the body. A man from your group, someone you have known your entire life, lying face down in the dirt, 30 feet from where everyone slept. The back of his skull is caved in. The rock that did it is still nearby. Everyone in the camp is awake now. Everyone is looking at the same thing. And every single person already knows, without courts, without police, without any institution between them and what just happened, that something has to be done. There is no procedure, no law written anywhere, no authority to call, just 30 people standing in the early morning light, looking at a body, and understanding at a level beneath language that if this moment is not handled correctly, the group itself might not survive it. Murder is not a modern invention. The oldest confirmed evidence of lethal interpersonal violence in the human fossil record dates to approximately 430,000 years ago. A Homo heidelbergensis skull found at Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain, bearing two overlapping fractures that could only have been produced by repeated blows from the same implement to the same location with deliberate force. The wound pattern is inconsistent with an accident or a fall. Someone killed this person intentionally, nearly 500,000 years ago. The record only accumulates from there. At a site called Crow Creek in South Dakota, dating to around 1325 AD, archaeologists discovered a mass grave containing the remains of nearly 500 individuals, men, women, and children, bearing evidence of scalping, dismemberment, and perimortem trauma so systematic it could only have been organized violence. At Talheim in Germany, dating to 5000 BCE, 34 skeletons were found in a single pit, all killed by blows to the skull from stone axes. At Aesparnschletz in Austria, similar evidence from the same period. Violence between humans is as old as humans. It did not begin with civilization. It did not require weapons of war or organized armies. It required only the permanent feature of ancient social life that has never changed and has never gone away. People who knew each other, living too close together, with too much at stake. So when a murder happened in a hunter-gatherer group, not a war, not a raid, but one person killing another person within the group itself, what actually happened? The answer comes from three sources: the skeletal record, which preserves the physical evidence of violence and its aftermath; the ethnographic record, which documents how modern hunter-gatherer communities handle killing within the group; and evolutionary biology, which tells us why the responses that emerge across every culture are not arbitrary. They are solutions to a specific, recurring, high-stakes problem. The problem is this: a murder inside a small group of 30 people is not just a tragedy, it is a structural crisis. In a group that size, everyone is connected to everyone else through overlapping bonds of kinship, alliance, debt, and obligation. The victim has family, the killer has family. Those two sets of people now exist inside the same 30-person unit that has to keep functioning, keep hunting, keep gathering, keep making collective decisions, keep surviving together the morning after. If the group does nothing, it signals that killing inside the group carries no consequence. The social contract that makes cooperation possible begins to dissolve. If the group overreacts, if the response produces a second killing, then a third, the cycle of retaliatory violence can destroy a group from the inside faster than any predator could from the outside. The response to murder had to be calibrated, firm enough to restore the social contract, controlled enough not to shatter the group in the process of enforcing it. Every solution ancient humans developed was trying to solve exactly that problem. The most consistent response documented across hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide is not execution, it is not exile, it is something more psychologically precise: confrontation by consensus. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, who spent decades studying hunter-gatherer conflict resolution across dozens of cultures on multiple continents, found a pattern so consistent it suggested a biological baseline rather than cultural variation. When a killing occurred within the group, the community's first response was collective deliberation, not a trial in any formal sense. A sustained, often days-long process of group discussion in which the circumstances of the killing were examined. The killer's history within the group was assessed. The victims' relationships and standing were weighed, and the group arrived, through conversation, pressure, and consensus, at a shared judgment about what had happened and what it meant. This was not chaos. It was structured by deep familiarity. In a group of 30 people who had lived together for years, everyone already knew everything relevant: who the killer was, what their history of behavior looked like, whether this was an isolated act or the culmination of a pattern, whether the killing had been provoked and by what, whether the victim had contributed to the circumstances of their own death. The group did not need evidence in the modern sense. They had lived with both parties. The deliberation was less about establishing facts, which were usually known, and more about establishing meaning. Was this person still safe to have inside the group? Was the social breach repairable? What did justice require in this specific situation, among these specific people? The outcomes of that deliberation varied, and the range reveals something important about how ancient justice actually worked. In cases where the killing was judged to have been provoked, a response to genuine threat, a moment of extreme situational pressure, an act that the group's collective assessment determined could be understood, even if not excused, the response was often reintegration, not forgiveness in any simple sense, a structured process of acknowledgement, compensation to the victim's family through food or labor or alliance obligations, and a period of heightened scrutiny that functioned as both punishment and probation. In cases where the killer was judged to be dangerous, where the act reflected a pattern of disregard for group welfare, where the person was seen as likely to kill again, the response was exile, removal from the group. In a world without cities, without other communities within walking distance that would necessarily accept a stranger, exile was frequently a death sentence, but it was a death sentence that preserved the group's integrity without requiring the group to kill one of its own members. And in cases where the threat was judged to be immediate and unresolvable, where exile was impractical, where the killer had already demonstrated that they would not accept the group's judgment, the ethnographic record documents a third response: collective execution, not carried out by one person, carried out by the group as a whole, or by a designated individual acting with explicit group sanction, specifically to prevent the act from becoming the foundation of a private blood feud. The distribution of responsibility was not accidental. It was the mechanism that prevented the murder of the murderer from producing a second cycle of retaliatory violence. If everyone was responsible, no single person or family bore the obligation of revenge. Bohm called this pattern the collective management of individuals whose behavior threatened group stability, reverse dominance hierarchy, and he argued it was not just a response to murder, it was the foundational political structure of hunter-gatherer life. For most of human prehistory, the evidence suggests small groups actively and deliberately suppressed the emergence of dominant individuals who tried to take more than their share, who tried to impose their will on the group, who tried to use violence to accumulate power. The mechanisms were gossip, ridicule, ostracism, and when those failed, coordinated physical action by the group against the individual. Murder was the most extreme case of the behavior that reverse dominance hierarchy was designed to contain. A person who killed another person inside the group was not just a killer. They were a person who had declared, through their action, that their individual will superseded the group's claim on their behavior. That was not just a crime, it was a political statement, and ancient human groups responded to it politically through collective deliberation and collective action, rather than delegating the response to any single authority. This is where modern criminal justice comes from, not from kings or priests or the first civilizations, from 30 people standing in the early morning light around a body, understanding that what they did next had to be both just and survivable. There is one more layer to this, and it is the one that sits heaviest. The skeletal record of prehistoric violence does not only document killers and victims, it documents something else: the care that followed, at multiple sites where evidence of interpersonal violence has been found. The same individuals show evidence of survived injuries, wounds that healed, fractures that were set and knitted, trauma that was treated in some fashion by someone. People who had been attacked and survived were cared for. The group that had to manage the violence of a killer also had to manage the recovery of the wounded. Both obligations existed simultaneously. The same social bonds that produced the deliberation, the exile, The collective response to murder also produced the person who stayed with the injured through the weeks it took for a broken bone to knit. There was no separation between justice and care in ancient human societies. They were expressions of the same underlying thing, the group's investment in its own members, the collective decision, made repeatedly and at real cost, that the people inside the group mattered, that what happened to them mattered, and that both harm and healing required a collective response. Think about the last time you watched a news story about a murder and felt, before any analysis, before any deliberation, before understanding any of the facts, the immediate visceral sense that something had been violated, not just a person, something larger, something that held people together. That feeling is not a product of civilization. It is not something law created in you. It is the output of a system built across hundreds of thousands of years of small groups managing the hardest problems social life produces. Someone did the unthinkable, and everyone who knew both of them had to figure out how to keep living together after. Your ancestors solved that problem without courts, without prisons, without any written law. They solved it by doing what humans, at their most fundamental level, have always done. They talked, they deliberated, they reached a judgment together, and then they lived with what they decided. Every court that has ever convened, every jury that has ever deliberated, every legal tradition that has ever tried to balance justice against the survival of the community that must carry it. All of it is the same conversation, just with more people in the room.